It started with a sound. Not the sound of gunfire, but of footsteps, thousands of them echoing through the streets of Nairobi. Young men and women, students and street vendors, all marching under the same cry, "Not in our name." They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons. But what they carried was far more dangerous to any corrupt regime conviction. When their government raised prices beyond reach, they stood up. When corruption devoured their future, they shouted back. And when bullets came, they did not run. They mourned their fallen and returned the next morning. This is not fiction. This is the youth of Kenya in 2025, a generation that decided silence was no longer an option. Their courage has now crossed borders, inspiring voices far beyond Nairobi. From Gaborone to Cape Town, from Ouagadougou to Johannesburg, one message echoes louder than ever: Africa will not be ruled by fear anymore. And among those voices stands Julius Malema, fiery, unapologetic, and calling the youth of Africa to look at Kenya's defiance and follow it. In his speech, he saluted another name now carried with reverence across the continent: Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the man who dared to chase away French control and reclaim his nation's destiny. So the question becomes, is this the dawn of Africa's second independence, this time not by guns, but by economic freedom? Or will the same old forces, foreign and domestic, find new ways to silence this awakening? If you believe that the truth matters more than the headlines, stay with me. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why what's happening in Nairobi, Ouagadougou, and Cape Town isn't just about Africa, it's about all of us. Please share if you stand for justice. Subscribe if you believe that freedom should never come with a price tag. It was not a political rally. It was a call to arms, not with bullets, but with ideas. 12 years after the birth of the economic freedom fighters, Julius Malema stood before a sea of red berets under the South African sun. Behind him, the crowd stretched for miles, students, workers, mothers, veterans, all waiting for something different from the speeches they'd heard all their lives. Malema didn't start with promises. He started with a warning. Fighters, he said, look at the youth of Kenya. In that single sentence, he turned the crowd's gaze thousands of miles north to a nation where young people had risen unarmed, yet unbreakable. When the government raised taxes and fuel prices, Kenya's youth didn't surrender. They filled the streets with chants of "Not in our name." They stood against corruption, faced live bullets, and refused to retreat. Many died, but their courage became legend. Malema paused. The silence in the stadium felt like the breath before a storm. Then he raised his voice. If they can fight, so can we. That moment shifted the air. The speech stopped being local. It became continental. Malema's words drew invisible lines across Africa, connecting the fearless youth of Kenya, the disciplined soldiers of Burkina Faso, and the restless hearts of South Africa. He named Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young Burkinabe leader who had dared to defy France to reclaim his country's gold and to unite the Sahel under the banner of sovereignty. We stand with him, Malema declared. The crowd roared back as if those words were thunder. For the first time in years, the audience wasn't just listening, they were believing. He called upon President Mabo in Botswana, urging him to remove the American military base on African soil. He spoke of unity of minerals that must return to the hands of their rightful owners. He spoke of land not as property, but as identity. The message was unmistakable. Africa's next revolution would not come from generals or presidents. It would come from communities that refused to be silent. Then came the challenge: direct, specific, urgent. The EFF, he said, would not wait for others to act. They would begin organizing for the 2026 local government elections. Every province, every ward, every street must have an active branch, a base of people who could hold the ruling elite accountable. He listed names like a commander assigning positions on a battlefield: Kaicha, Nyanga, Langa, Southern Cape, George, Central Ku. All must become homes of the EFF. The mission was clear: build from the ground up. No branch, no change. The metaphor was powerful democracy, not as an event but as a muscle that must be exercised every day. He spoke directly to the leaders sitting behind him. How can you sit here comfortably knowing your branch is not led by the EFF? How can you demand change when your own home is not organized? The crowd murmured in agreement. Older men nodded. Younger ones clenched their fists. For many, it was the first time someone had turned frustration into direction. And then Malema gave them a deadline: December of this year. Any branch formed next year, he warned, would be disqualified from the elections. The room shifted again, this time from emotion to discipline. In those moments, you could feel what historians often call the beginning of something. The EFF wasn't just preparing for elections, it was preparing for confrontation with a system that had failed the poor for decades. It wasn't just about politics, it was about dignity, about whether the people of Africa could finally govern themselves in truth, not just in theory. And as Malema's voice echoed over the crowd, you could almost sense the invisible connection between the youth who stood firm in the streets of Nairobi and the thousands now standing in South Africa, whispering the same vow, "Not in our name." The crowd had grown restless, their cheers turning into a low hum of anticipation. Malema had already invoked Kenya, Burkina Faso, and Botswana, but now he turned his fire toward home. He leaned forward, his tone shifting from inspiration to confrontation. Electricity, he said, has become a luxury in South Africa. The stadium went silent. Our people can't afford to cook. They can't afford to light their homes. And why? Because corruption has made power more expensive than gold. Then he pointed directly at the government, naming names with the precision of a surgeon cutting open a wound. "Ramaphosa," he shouted, "you put Beki Sili on special leave and you call that justice? You have 2 ministers doing the same job while our people starve." Gasps rippled through the audience. These were not polite political remarks, they were accusations broadcast to the nation. 700 million rand, he thundered. That's what they are spending for a dialogue, for talking while our children sit in classrooms without food, without uniforms, without jobs. His words hit like hammers. He paused only to let the outrage sink in. Then came the alternative, a vision so simple it felt revolutionary. "Take that money," he said, "and pay for free education. Take that money and build our factories again. Take that money and feed our children." The applause was not just noise, it was catharsis. Years of frustration bottled up under unemployment and empty promises finally found release. Malema raised his hand again. "We don't want another dialogue," he said. "Parliament is dialogue. We already pay politicians to talk. We don't need to pay them again to pretend they are listening." The crowd erupted, their voices overlapping laughter, anger, hope. For a moment, the rally felt less like politics and more like a revival, a moral awakening in red uniforms. And then came the turning point, the moment that would be replayed across social media and television for days. He spoke about the extortionists' gangs who demanded protection fees from small businesses and construction sites. His voice hardened. "They came here," he said, "when we built this dome. They wanted a cut." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "And we told them, if your parents still love you, you'll leave this place right now. Because if you try that nonsense here in the EFF, we will show you flames." The crowd exploded. Some cheered, others gasped. It was a moment of raw defiance, half warning, half declaration. He was not just talking about gangsters. He was talking about a culture of fear that had seeped into everyday life. That was the climax, the point where anger met courage, where despair turned into direction. Online reactions poured in within hours. Some South Africans called it reckless rhetoric. Others called it the speech of a generation. Hashtags like March FF 12 years and My Not in Our Name began trending. Young people who had never attended a rally before started sharing clips quoting Malema's words about Kenya and Traore. Meanwhile, political analysts appeared on television screens across Johannesburg. Some accused him of inciting confrontation. Others admitted reluctantly that his message had struck a nerve. "He's saying what millions wish they could," one commentator noted. In Burkina Faso, the speech did not go unnoticed. State radio mentioned the statement of solidarity with Captain Ibrahim Traoré, calling it a gesture of continental unity. In Kenya, youth leaders posted the clip with a simple caption, "We see you, South Africa." For the first time in years, it felt like Africa was talking to itself across borders, across generations, across the old colonial lines. By the time Malema raised his fist for the final salute, the crowd was chanting, "Economic freedom in our lifetime." The energy was electric, not the kind that comes from wires, but from willpower. He smiled, stepped back from the podium, and said quietly, "We don't need permission to dream anymore." And in that moment, you could almost hear it, the heartbeat of a continent awakening. When the echoes of Malema's words finally faded from the loudspeakers, something quiet yet powerful began to move across South Africa. In townships where politics had long been just background noise, people started talking again, not about promises, but about participation. Taxi drivers replayed clips from the rally on their phones. Market women discussed 700 million for talking as they sold fruit under the sun. And in small churches, pastors quoted Malema's line, "Parliament is dialogue." Across the Western Cape, new EFF branches began to form. In Nyanga, in George, in Kaicha, red flags appeared on unfinished buildings and community halls. Students met in borrowed classrooms to draft lists of local issues from broken streetlights to missing water pumps. For the first time in years, civic life felt alive again. It wasn't a protest, it was a preparation. People were realizing that democracy didn't belong to those in parliament, it belonged to those willing to show up. And in the middle of this quiet organization, something remarkable happened. Ordinary South Africans began linking their struggle to a wider African awakening. In the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had already become a symbol, a soldier who turned down foreign deals and put Burkina Faso's gold, cotton, and soil back in the hands of its citizens. His image, once confined to headlines, now appeared on murals and posters across South Africa's campuses. For many, Traoré and Malema represented two sides of the same coin, one fought with policy and discipline, the other with words and rebellion. Both stood for the same principle: Africa must belong to Africans. But not everyone celebrated. Mainstream media in Johannesburg and Cape Town painted the movement as radical populism. Financial papers warned investors about political volatility. Some ministers called the speech reckless. Yet, as often happens in history, those warnings only fed the movement's momentum. In the Western Cape, civic groups began auditing local budgets, demanding public transparency. Youth collectives organized cleanup campaigns using the same slogan Malema borrowed from Kenya. "Not in our name." Even in communities that weren't aligned with the EFF, his message about waste and corruption resonated deeply. It was as if a social mirror had been lifted, forcing people to confront what they had tolerated for too long, a system where poverty was normal and power unaccountable. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, radio commentators noted something unprecedented: the cross-continental echo between Malema's call for economic freedom and Traoré's doctrine of resource sovereignty. In both countries, young people were saying the same thing: no more middlemen, no more excuses. By October's end, political analysts began calling it the People's Quarter. Social media was flooded with photos of new EFF registration drives and community workshops. One viral image captured an old man in Soweto painting the slogan, "Let the people lead," on a crumbling wall. The impact was not measured in votes, not yet, but in mindset. For decades, South Africans had seen politics as a spectator sport. Now it was becoming a participatory movement, messy, loud, but undeniably alive. And across the continent, a question began to form, whispered first in university dorms and street corners, and then louder on national television. If Kenya's youth can defy power, if Traoré can defy empires, and if Malema can defy silence, what's stopping the rest of Africa? The answer was simple, and it was spreading fast: nothing anymore. Across the ocean, in newsrooms from Washington to Paris, the echoes of Malema's voice began to reach Western ears. Editors debated the tone: was it a populist rant or a continental awakening? Analysts on cable television called it the sound of an Africa growing impatient with old masters. In Washington, the State Department released a cautious statement emphasizing the importance of democratic institutions. But between the lines, you could sense unease. It wasn't the rhetoric that worried them, it was the rhythm. For the first time in decades, Africa's youth weren't asking for help, they were rejecting it. American viewers, especially the older generation, might have felt a familiar tremor. It sounded like the early 1960s again: the sit-ins, the marches, the cries of, "We want freedom now." The language was different, the continent was different, but the pulse was the same. When Julius Malema said, "We don't want another dialogue," it echoed something Martin Luther King once warned: "We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights." Both men separated by continents, and time understood a truth that governments often forget: that people eventually grow tired of being told to wait. The American media, however, struggled to place this new Africa into their familiar frames. They wanted to talk about coups and corruption, not about a youth demanding economic independence. Yet behind the noise, something profound was happening. A generation of Africans inspired by figures like Ibrahim Traoré and Malema was turning away from the West's moral authority and crafting their own. European outlets reacted differently. In France, the coverage was defensive. Commentators dismissed Malema's call to remove American and French influence as demagogic. But others, especially younger journalists, quietly admitted that Africa's message of sovereignty resonated far beyond its borders. In the wake of global disillusionment with politics, here was a region demanding not just elections, but meaning. In the United States, some academics began to draw parallels between today's Africa and America's own forgotten neighborhoods, where poverty, police brutality, and disenchantment echo eerily similar patterns. For those who lived through the civil rights movement, the sight of Kenyan youth shouting, "Not in our name," felt like déjà vu, a reminder that justice is never granted, only claimed. A few voices even within America began asking uncomfortable questions. If we once fought for freedom in Selma and Montgomery, why do we now criticize Africans for doing the same in Nairobi and Ouagadougou? If we once chanted, "We shall overcome," can we not celebrate when others do? Meanwhile, global institutions, IMF, World Bank, NATO, watched with quiet anxiety. A politically awakened Africa meant harder negotiations, fewer handouts, and a stronger collective voice on the global stage. For ordinary Americans, especially those over 60 who have seen empires rise and fall, this new Africa may feel both strange and familiar. Strange because it speaks with newfound confidence, familiar because it revives an old belief that true democracy begins not in government halls, but in the hearts of the people. And as one commentator on PBS put it, perhaps what Africa is doing now is what America once did, reminding the world that freedom must not only be declared but defended. History doesn't always repeat itself, sometimes it simply changes its accent. What began as the echo of footsteps in the streets of Nairobi has become a chorus stretching from Cape Town to Ouagadougou. And if we listen closely beneath the chants and speeches, we can hear something ancient, the sound of a continent remembering its own worth. But every awakening comes with danger. Those who benefit from Africa's silence will not surrender easily. Western corporations, local elites, and hidden interests will call this instability. They will warn of radicalism. Yet what they fear is not chaos, it is clarity. Because for the first time, millions of Africans are asking a question the world hoped they would never ask. Why must we always beg for what is already ours? The youth of Kenya, the fighters of South Africa, the citizens of Burkina Faso, they are not waiting for permission anymore. They are building something raw and new, a democracy rooted in action, not slogans, in dignity, not dependency. And if this experiment succeeds, it could change everything, not just for Africa, but for the balance of the world itself. To those watching from America, especially those who lived through the 1960s, this might feel like a déjà vu of justice, a revolution born not of hatred, but of hunger for fairness. You've seen it before when people once said, "We shall overcome." Now Africa says, "Not in our name." The message is universal freedom cannot be imported and justice cannot be borrowed. It must be built, owned, and protected one street, one village, one generation at a time. As Africa stands on the edge of a new century of independence, not from colonial armies, but from economic chains, the world will have to choose whether to help it rise or to stand in its way. And those of us who still believe in justice have a choice too, to witness history or to shape it. So let me leave you with this. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or will Africa need a new wave of leaders who fear nothing but silence to finish what history began? Please share this video if you believe that truth is stronger than propaganda. Subscribe if you believe that the freedom of one nation belongs to all humanity. Because one thing is certain, Africa is no longer asking for freedom. It is declaring it.